Welcome to the Schlumberger RSDH assembly video. Remember to use Loctite on all screws, except where screws will come in contact with plastic. The Loctite will destroy plastic. An example of plastic would be the fans. We will start out by installing the router to the bottom plate. Note the location of the 440 by 1/4 inch standoffs. The previous router, the Cisco 892, has a slightly different layout. Install 1 1/4 standoffs in the locations noted in this video. Do not over-tighten these standoffs, or they will break. Install the heatsink of the router with the screws provided that have a spring with them. To install the fans, use 440 by 3/4 inch screws. Install the screws first, then the filter, and then add the number of washers that were taken off of each screw. Note that the left side fans are labeled to the inside of the box, and the right side fan labels are facing the outside of the box. Add the fans with the wires oriented correctly. Use a 1/4 inch nut driver and a No. 1 Phillips screwdriver with 440 nylon insert nuts to reinstall. Repeat process for all 4 fans. To install the router plate, use 4 of 440 by ½ inch screws. They should be installed with a washer on the head of the screw, inserted into the bottom of the unit, and then another washer along with the crimp sleeve. Insert the router plate combo into the box with all of the ports facing the front of the unit and without scraping the fans. Line up the mounting holes on the bottom of the router plate combo with the 4 screws and tighten each one. Note the 4 holes in the top plate bracket, as well as the holes on the rear of the unit. Use 4 of 440 by 3/8 inch screws with a washer into each of the 4 holes on the rear of the unit to install the top plate bracket. Do not fully tighten the 4 screws on the rear of the unit until the top plate is in. Set unit aside and grab a motherboard and processor. Note on the processor a triangle on one corner. It is a key that lines up with the socket on the motherboard. On the socket you will see an area where there are no pinholes. Line the processor up with the key on the socket. Insert gently into socket. Using a flathead screwdriver, turn the screw to tighten the processor down to the unit. Next, install heatsink compound. Clean processor off. Using a very tiny amount, cover the entire metal portion of the processor. And make sure the entire processor is evenly coated. Next, we will install the CPU heatsink. Making sure that the heatsink is clean on the bottom that touches the processor. Install using the 4 screws built into the heatsink, which will tie in to the bracket underneath the motherboard. Next, plug in the fan power, noting that it is keyed to the receptacle on the motherboard. Unscrew the retaining screw for the MSATA drive if it is still inside the motherboard. Insert the MSATA drive by gently pushing in till it stops and pushing down. Using screw provided, screw in, but do not over tighten. Next, you'll insert the memory stick, noting that it has a key between the pins. Match that up to the receptacle on the motherboard. Push gently but firmly straight down until the clips lock into the memory. Move the motherboard to the side for the time being. In this clip, we'll be adding a terminal block. Note which holes are used to secure the terminal block to the plate. Using a 1/2-inch screw with a washer in the white clip, noting that the clip has 3 fingers which are oriented up on the terminal block that the cover gets secured to. Take care not to over tighten these screws. Repeat process for the front and rear terminal block. And depending on the revision, one of the terminal blocks will be on the top of the power supply. Next, we have the PCU. Note the 4 times the 440 by 3/8 screws along with the 4 mounting sleeves. Using the locations noted in the video, set the sleeves in place and set the PCU gently down on the sleeves and tighten each screw in its place. Note the orientation of the KVM bracket to the front of the top plate. Using 2 times 440 by 3/8 inch screws, secure the KVM bracket to the top plate. Using a 440 by 3/8 inch screw, secure the KVM to the bracket you just installed to the top plate. Noting the orientation of the KVM as opposed to the bracket. Fully tighten the KVM to the bracket at the moment, but in a later cut you will need to loosen it just slightly to add cables. Note the standoffs used to mount the main power supply, and also note the orientation of the power supply with the 3-prong plug facing the front of the unit and the 4-prong plug facing the rear of the unit. Install the power supply with 4 times 440 by 3/8 inch Phillips head screws. Note the location of the ground wire. These 2 pins go to the PCU. One wire goes from the fuse to the right side of the PCU, and the other wire goes from the main power to the left side of the PCU. Press each spade lug onto the PCU firmly. Note the 3-pin plug coming from the terminal block, noting that the plug is keyed. Push it onto the front of the power supply. Note the 4-pin plug on the rear terminal block, noting that it is keyed. Push it onto the rear of the power supply. Note location of the 7 standoffs for the top plate that should be mounted to the router. To Depending on the revision, the locations of these are different. Also, on older revisions, there are no standoffs on the back top plate bracket. The standoffs on the router vary from 1 1/4 to 1 inch depending on the revision. Use 7 x 440 by 3/8 inch screws to mount the top plate. Note locations of mounting holes on motherboard. Orient the motherboard with connections towards the front of the unit. Regardless of the revision of the unit, there should be 4 standoffs that the motherboard will mount to. Also, on some revisions, there will be 440 screws instead of nuts. Tighten motherboard securely to the top plate. Plug in the 4-pin Molex connector for the fans on the rear right of the unit. Next, plug in the power to the Pico PSU/motherboard, noting that the black wires, or negative, with the spade connectors will be together, and the other wires, which can be different colors with spade connectors on the rear of the unit, will also be pushed together. Next, install the Pico PSU, noting that it will only go into the motherboard one way. Plug in the 12-volt auxiliary power to the motherboard, noting that the plug is keyed. The location of the plug will vary depending on the motherboard or not exist at all. For these next steps, we have moved the motherboard and front plate out of the unit to show you each plug. For you to add plugs to the motherboard from the front plate, you will need to have the front plate sitting directly in front of the RSDH unit. Plug in the serial cables. Depending on the revision, the serial cables will be in different locations. When you are plugging the serial cables in, note the red wire on the flat cable and pin 1 on the motherboard. On the motherboard, it will show a 1 or have an arrow pointing to pin 1 of the cable. Plug in the 2 USB cables coming from the front plate. To wire the router to the front plate, please follow the examples in this video. At the end of this video is a diagram illustrating the wiring of an RSDH unit. In the revision shown in the video is a Cisco 891 router. The console cable will be in a different location on the older revisions with an 892 Cisco router. On the 892 Cisco router, it will be the 4th position over from the left side of the router. Insert the cable with the gray connector coming from the VGA connector on the front panel into the bottom of the KVM. The next cable has a VGA, USB, and an HDMI connector. Plug the USB connector into any USB port. Screw the VGA cable into its respective port on the motherboard. Lastly, plug the HDMI cable into the HDMI port on the KVM. Plug in a 1-foot Ethernet cable from the PCU to the KVM on the left side. Note the location of the ground stud. Put the green ground wire coming from the main power supply and the green ground wire coming from the front power on the front panel onto the ground stud on the top front right of the unit. Use a 1/4-20 nylon insert nut with a 7/16 inch socket and ratchet and tighten securely. Using the twisted black and white wire supplied on the front panel PC power push button, insert it fully onto the power button header onto the motherboard. It should be marked on the motherboard or be a certain color, such as the red on this motherboard shown in the video. This wire has no polarity. Please consult support@petrodeck.com for the location of this header on the motherboard if needed. Install the 4-pin plug coming from the router power switch on the front panel onto the router on the right side. On earlier revisions, this plug was just a simple barrel connector. Note the location of the 2 wires on the rear terminal block. These wires go to the other plug on the router power button. Note, on earlier revisions, this terminal block was mounted on top of the power supply. Note the location of the KVM power wires coming from the Pico PSU. On earlier revisions, the KVM power was supplied through a voltage regulator that was mounted to the front of the top plate or on the side of the PCU. Insert barrel connector fully into the KVM. Note the location of the white or neutral wire and location of the wire on the front terminal block. Note the location of the black or hot wire and the location where you will screw it into the front terminal block. Install both wires on terminal block as demonstrated in this video. These next two clips will show a before and after shot of an RSDH unit when tie wrapping it. As you are tie wrapping the unit, make sure to secure any wires that would go into the fans. Before securing the front and top lid to the unit, plug the unit into wall power and a mouse keyboard as well as a monitor and confirm that the unit turns on and that the fans are not making any unnecessary noise. As well as do a quick QC of the unit, making sure all parts of the unit are plugged in. This concludes the building of an RSDH unit. For additional support, please email support@petrodac.com.